Good morning, students. Today we are going to talk about free verse, T.S.Eliot's love song of J.Alfred Prufrock, which is a dramatic monologue, and finally the narrative poem. Free verse was part of a large international revolution that broke the mold of Victorian and academic conventions in all arts, that departed from what was going on in Victorian and academic conventions in all arts. The modern poets wanted to abandon all neoclassical fixed forms, like the heroic couplet, and genre distinctions or groups or categories, in favor of organically determined functional forms, in favor of simpler and more natural functional forms. The general revolt against the authority of the past encouraged the rejection of established poetic diction and the promotion of a more particularized and idiomatic language representing the individual perception of the writer. Poetic diction means linguistic style, the vocabulary and metaphors used in writing poetry. Idiomatic language, a phrase or expression that presents a figurative, non-literal meaning. Individual perception means the attitudes, the personality, motives, interests, past experiences, and expectations of the writers. Free verse is writing presented as verse that does not employ traditional metrical systems. There are no rules. The kinds of free verse writing are limited only by the capacity, the ability of human inventiveness in language, perceiving form in non-metrical verse, talking about it intelligently, making generalizations is therefore difficult, and criticism has made few advances to help the student or the general reader. Free verse then is verse without meter, but also verse that observes other formal conventions besides meter. The verse line lacking an audible organization of accented and unaccented syllables remains a visible unit on the page. It has a shape, it has a form, perhaps not traditional, but it does have a shape and it does have a form. It has a beginning, an ending, and a syllable count, all of which participate in the sense of verse form. It is frequently, though not always, justified to the left margin, begins from the left margin. Rhythm remains, though not rhythmic regularity or predictability, as in metrical verse. The lines may form stanzas and they may use rhyme. Before the free verse revolution was started by the American Walt Whitman's 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, the greatest freedom ventured by poets was in the irregular ode, where poets mixed lines of different and unpredictable length and rhyme schemes. T.S.Eliot, 1888-1965. Thomas Sterne Eliot was born in the United States in 1888 and died in England in 1965. From 1915 he lived in England, and in 1927 he became a British subject. Throughout his work he has been concerned with the problem of establishing stability after chaos. His early poetry mirrors the disintegration which his later poetry suggests a possible cure for. From the point of view of its influence on other writing, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land remains the single most important poem of the century. No poem written since strikes one as having made a more exciting and significant break with tradition. Elements which distinguish Eliot's poetry. There are 5 elements which distinguish his poetry. The first element is fragmentation, which means breaking into parts, splitting into parts. The second element is allusion, which means an indirect reference to a book, to a poem, to a citation, to a remark, and so on, by another writer, or by another speaker, or by another author. The third element is collage, a piece of art made by sticking various different materials or fabrics onto a backing. Myth, a traditional story. Fantasy, full of delusion. Legend, again a traditional story. It is popular and it is regarded as historical, as the British stories of King Arthur and the Round Table. The picture on the right is a jigsaw puzzle. A jigsaw puzzle is a picture made up of pieces, different pieces of different shapes that have to be fitted together in order to give me a complete, coherent portrait or picture. The Love Song of J.Alfred Prufrock by T.S.Eliot. This poem is a dramatic monologue. The speaker is not T.S.Eliot, but a character which T.S.Eliot creates by the name of Alfred Prufrock. Prufrock represents the generation that witnessed World War I and World War II and the depression that came after it. He is a representative of that period. So in other words, he also represents T.S. Eliot. The theme of frustration. Frustration means the feeling of being upset or annoyed as a result of being unable to change or achieve something. This is what was bothering Prufrock. So, the best known figure of frustration is Eliot's Mr. Prufrock. The poem illustrates the background of Eliot's early poetry. The sordid or immoral horror of mean streets, streets that are noted for their poverty, streets that are noted for their violence, streets that are noted for their crimes, and the empty horror of the poet's own social environment. It was a period where people felt they were empty inside. This is an epigraph. An epigraph is a short quotation at the beginning of a poem, and it is intended to suggest the theme of the poem. The words of the epigraph do not belong to T.S.Eliot, but to a different author. We will notice that the epigraph here is written in Latin. It is from Dante's Inferno, from Dante's Divine Comedy. It is part of the big epic poem, and it tells the journey of Dante through hell. In the epigraph, which is from Dante's Inferno, Canto 27, verses 61 to 66, one of the damned souls which lives in the Inferno replies in these words to Dante when Dante asks this soul, what's its name? The damned soul replies, if I thought my answer were to one who could return to the world, I would not speak. But as none ever did return alive from this inferno, without fear of infamy, without fear of shame, without fear of disrepute or disgrace, I will answer you. So, the soul, the damned soul here, will answer Dante's question because he knows that Dante will not leave hell and go to the other world where he will disgrace him and ill fame him. seems to suggest that he regards the reader as sharing his plight. Prufrock here is telling us how he feels, showing us his frustrations, because he knows that we too will keep silent. We will not be able to confess what he is suffering from, because that means we too have the same feelings. We too bear the same feelings. So, no one will know Mr. Prufrock's shame because no one can report it. That is, Prufrock here knows that he is safe. He will expose how he feels, how he truly feels, how he suffers, and he knows that no one will disgrace him. It also suggests that Prufrock himself is speaking from an inferno or another wasteland. The poem. Let us go then, you and I. When the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table, let us go through certain half-deserted streets. The muttering retreats. Let us go then. Us. We have two characters here, two people here, a you and an I. The I is Prufrock. The you, some critics say, is a woman that he loves. Other critics say that the you is the same character, Prufrock, but speaking to himself. He has a kind of split character. They are deciding to take action and go somewhere. The timing, the setting of their journey will take place in the evening, when the evening is spread out against the sky, when it is almost dark. Then he makes a comparison, a simile. When the air is drowsy and numb, like a patient, like a person who has just been operated on and has been given ether to make him senseless. So that's why he has chosen the evening. He doesn't want to be totally aware of what is going on around him. He doesn't want anybody to sense even his existence. And then he repeats again, let us go. This indicates that although they have decided to go on that journey, yet that journey hasn't begun yet. He is hesitant. through certain half-deserted streets. Again, the atmosphere he chooses to go on this journey in is weird. He chooses half-deserted streets, streets that have no inhabitants. He doesn't want anybody to see him. He doesn't want to, to meet anybody on that journey. The muttering retreats. Muttering is expressions of dissatisfaction, unclear speech, of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. So, it is nighttime. People are muttering. They are speaking in an unclear manner. The sounds are disappearing one after the other. The streets are full of sawdust restaurants. In other words, dirty and disgusting and smelly streets. Streets that are not even nice or decent. And these streets are so long, they follow like a tedious argument. This is a simile, a comparison. The streets are like a boring, monotonous, dull, uninteresting argument of insidious intent, an argument that is not honest, an argument that is indirect or crafty or deceitful. Where is this argument taking us? It is taking us to an overwhelming question. The poet here, or Prufrock here, doesn't tell us what this overwhelming question is. And he doesn't want us even to ask what it is. Forget about it. Let us go and make our visit. Again, repetition of let us go indicates that they haven't moved. They haven't taken one step towards their journey. This is a picture of the oyster shells, the restaurants that sell oyster and shells. And this is a figure of a man who is afraid, who has no courage, who is totally frustrated. This is a patient etherized upon a table. These are half-deserted streets, streets that have barely no inhabitants. And this is what sawdust means. The dust that is left behind when we saw wood. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. We now know where Alfred Prufrock wants to go. It's a party. The party is full of women. And these women are discussing Michelangelo. Who is Michelangelo? He is an Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet, born in 1475 and died in 1564. He is important because he influenced the development of Western art. He dealt with topics like nudity, obscenity, sex, women. Such topics ended the puritanical spirit of Victorian England. Victorian England was a very religious period in the history of England. So, this shows us the new social community's mentality, the new interests that filled the minds of the people after World War I and World War II. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. The image here is a complex one. T.S.Eliot is trying to make his imagery concrete so that we can visualize it. He is describing the fog. The color of the fog was yellow. The fog was full of smoke. It was full of soot that fell from the chimneys. And then we have descriptions like rubs its back upon the window panes. The yellow fog does not have a back, yet here T.S. Eliot pictures it as if it's a cat that is rubbing its back upon the window panes. So the fog is moving around the window panes like a cat that rubs its back upon the window panes. The yellow smoke, the poet here pictures it as having a muzzle. What is a muzzle? A muzzle is the projecting part of an animal's face, which includes the nose and mouth. This is the muzzle. So the yellow smoke here is rubbing itself against the window panes like a cat rubs its muzzle against the window panes. The yellow smoke here licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. The cat, when it decides to settle down, it licks its tongue and settles down in a calm place. So the fog also settled down in the evening. And the evening here is described as having corners, as if it's a room which has corners where the yellow fog settles down in. The yellow fog had carried particles of soot that fell from the chimneys, like a cat that carried black soot on its back that fell from the chimneys. This cat, it slipped by the terrace, it moved by the terrace exactly like the fog or the smoke, and then it made a sudden leap, and then it jumped suddenly. The cat here can be seen jumping, and as it was a soft October night, as it was a cool October night, the cat curled around itself, whereas the fog curled around the house. The cat fell asleep, the fog settled down. The image here describes how Prufrock feels. He feels numb. He feels indifferent. He lacks energy. He lacks in action, exactly like the yellow fog or the cat that is lazy, that just wants to sleep and be inactive. Why is the fog described as being yellow? There are different types of fogs in the Western world, and perhaps here T.S.Eliot is referring to one of the greatest disasters that happened in 1952 when a killer fog hit London, and it was because of pollution that this killer fog arose. This is the house, and this is the window panes and the terrace that the fog slipped by. This is the fog. See how the fog here covers all the details and makes the vision unclear. This is a cat. It has curled around itself and is sleeping in a corner. This is a cat rubbing its back. And this is a cat that licked its tongue. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. Prufrock has a lot of time. Unlike Andrew Marvell, the metaphysical poet in his Coy Mistress, who states that there is no time to waste, Prufrock here has a lot of time to waste. Just like the fog, he is not in a hurry. He moves slowly. He decides slowly. He is not in a rush about anything, because time is all that he has now. There will be time, there will be time. This repetition is anaphora. He has a lot of time to meet people. He's not in a hurry. He has a lot of time to waste. He has a lot of time that he can use to create things with. He has a lot of time to work or to sleep. He has a lot of time to ask questions that require answers, that can be answered later on. I have time and you have time. We are not in a hurry. We are not rushing. We have time for 100 indecisions. We can go back on our decisions and we can have certain visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea, before we go to the party where the women come and go talking about Michelangelo. There is a lot of time. This is all we have today. Time. Time is abundant. We are no longer in a hurry. We have reached, and here Prufrock is speaking about himself. He is an old man now. He is old, he is unable to communicate with others, he is unable to make decisions, he is unable to decide, he is unable, or he feels unable to be able to influence others, to impose his opinion on others. So he feels very, very indifferent, and he feels inactive. This is the muzzle, the nose and mouth together on animals. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So, Prufrock, he is unable to decide. He is old. He looks different now from what he looked like in the past. He is unable to decide whether to go to the party, whether to ask the question that he wants to ask, whether he still has in him the power to influence others, to obtain the admiration of others, like Michelangelo, that the women in the party are speaking about. In the love song of J.Alfred Prufrock, Eliot uses concrete imagery, as we saw concerning the yellow fog and the animal that rubbed its back against the window pane. He uses concrete imagery to communicate ideas and emotions. Association and suggestion takes the place of logical sequence. This is what happens when the poet uses fragmentation, when he uses pieces and he puts them side by side. We begin to understand by association and suggestion. T.S.Eliot's use of literary allusion. The allusions are there for definite artistic reasons. Partly, they are the result of his feeling of the immense importance of the past tradition, His sense that the past is always alive in the present, and that the poet is the heir of all writers before him. Allusion is also a way of contrasting the present and the past. The memories of the past come into the poem, and by combining with what the poet is showing about the present, we hear their association in a new key. Andrew Marvell has no time to waste, yet Prufrock, who is an old man who is inactive, has a lot of time to waste. They bring an ironical reminder of a melody that has been lost. Prufrock, who is now an old man, has lost a great deal when he became old. He is no longer that active young man admired by all, who had influence, who could change, who could make decisions, who had power to act, or of an ideal that has been forsaken. Prufrock is no longer the same energetic young man. The second point is one of structure. The poem is built dramatically out of conflicting oppositions, whose clash creates its activity. One such set of contrasts grows out of the literary references. It is that between Mr. Prufrock's world and the worlds and persons which are suggested in the allusions, for example, John the Baptist, Lazarus, Hesiod's Greek poem Works and Days, Michelangelo and Shakespeare, and above all the contrast between Mr. Prufrock's love song and Andrew Marvell's love poem to his coy mistress. Though the evening is static, at a standstill, Mr. Prufrock states in the rest of his paragraph that he intends to set out actively on a real or imaginary journey. Is it a real journey, or is it a journey through his own consciousness? The journey of his life, where the streets are the labyrinths of the mind, where the mean streets are the labyrinths of his mind. That is for us, the reader, to decide. That is why the poem is a dramatic monologue. The narrative poem. Narrative poems tell a story and have a plot. They include ballads and epics, idylls and lays, and tell of societies and heroic deeds. They can also be very dramatic when telling of a particular situation. The poems that make up this genre may be short or may be long, and the story it relates to may be complex or may be simple. It is usually dramatic, with objectives, with aims, diverse characters, many characters, and meter or no meter. We hear the voice of a teller who speaks about his characters. In a dramatic poem, the character's own thoughts and spoken statements over the past 30 years, narrative poems have made a comeback against the lyric approach to poetry that has dominated the past century. So now the narrative poem has become the norm of the 20th century and contemporary poetry. Ancient societies used narrative poetry to keep a record of their histories and traditions because its formal meter and rhyme scheme made it easy to memorize and recount to others. A narrative poem is a kind of poem that tells a story. It began in the oral tradition, and it is one of the oldest forms of poetry. There are three kinds of narrative poems: the epic, the ballad, and the straight narrative. Epics are long and use elevated style and subject to tell stories of important or mythical events, such as the history of the world or the founding of a nation. An example of an epic is Dante's Inferno. Ballads are songs, and they have a simple meter and rhyme scheme. They typically have a series of 4-line stanzas and often contain repetitive refrains. Unlike epics, they tend to focus on a single dramatic event, moral or lesson, and provide little information about the story's setting. An example of a ballad is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The straightforward narratives are poems that tell a story and have a rhyme and meter scheme, but are not actually epics or ballads. An example is Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. A narrative poem has a narrator, and the story is told from the point of view of that narrator. The narrator may be the main character, a secondary character, or an observer. A narrative poem also contains many of the narrative elements found in other types of fiction, including setting, characterization, plot, conflict, tone, dialogue, and symbolism. Because it has a plot, a narrative poem also has rising action, climax, and resolution. Like other types of poems, a narrative poem uses imagery and figurative language, like similes and metaphors. It also has a definite rhyme and meter scheme and sound patterns. For instance, a ballad stanza is usually 4 lines of iambic trimeter, and it has an A-B-C-D rhyming scheme. Unlike ballads, which tend to be repetitive and short, epics are quite long. Homer's The Odyssey, for instance, is a narrative poem of 12,000 lines. Epics tend to be structured in 2 rhymed lines of iambic pentameter, also known as a heroic couplet. A narrative poem is not limited to a particular subject or theme, and it may relay any kind of story, including the story of a hero or a heroine, and the story of familial love, or the story of an unrequited love. Ballads tend to focus on one particular conflict, and on only a couple of characters, while epics tend to span years, depict long journeys and heroic lives, and deal with a number of different conflicts and characters. Narrative poetry contains many of the same literary conventions found in novels and short stories, including plot, characterization, setting, conflict, tone, symbolism, dialogue, and so on. The poet is neither the narrator nor a character in the story. The narrative is told from the point of view of a main character, a witness to the events in the story, or a person who is retelling a story he or she heard from another person. Like other forms of poetry, narrative poetry makes use of imagery, figurative language, and sound patterns. Like other narratives, narrative poems usually begin with a description of the main characters or the setting. The main purpose of narrative poetry is to entertain, not to express the poet's thoughts or feelings. Narrative poems can be fictional or non-fictional. That is why it is different from the lyric poem. It can be related to historical or biographical events. The end. Thank you.